This is Mr. Geronimo, and tonight's story might keep you awake. There are places in this world that do not want you. They do not warn you with signs or fences or the kind of obvious menace that reasonable people understand. They simply wait, patient and cold, buried beneath layers of rock and root and rotting timber, and when you walk above them you feel it in the soles of your feet before you feel it anywhere else. A faint vibration. A tremor so slight that your conscious mind dismisses it even as something older and deeper inside your skull begins to scream. I know this now. I did not know it on the morning of June 14th when I loaded the last of my gear into the bed of Douglas Hunter's truck and climbed into the passenger seat and watched the suburbs of Charleston fall away behind us like a life I was never going to get back. The trip had been Douglas's idea. He was 54 years old and built like a man who had spent 3 decades swinging a pickaxe, which in fact he had. He had retired from the McDowell County mining operation 6 years earlier with a pension that barely covered his mortgage and a persistent cough that he refused to discuss with anyone. When he called me in early May and told me he wanted to organize a group excursion into the backcountry near the old Elkhorn Creek mines, I did not ask why. I should have. I should have asked a great many things. But Douglas had a way of making dangerous ideas sound like the most natural suggestions in the world, and by the time I realized what we were walking into, it was far too late to walk back out. The group assembled over the following weeks. Beverly Stevens was the first to confirm. She was 60 years old and had been hiking the Appalachian ridgeline since before I was born. She carried a hand-carved walking stick made from sourwood, and she wore the same pair of broken-in boots on every outing, and she moved through rough terrain with a fluidity that made younger hikers look clumsy by comparison. Nathan Tucker came next. At 71, he was the oldest among us, and he spoke with the slow, deliberate cadence of a man who had learned long ago that most words were wasted. He had grown up in the coal country of McDowell County, and his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather had all gone into the mines, and not all of them had come back out. Nathan never talked about that, not directly. But sometimes when the conversation turned to certain subjects he would go very quiet, and his eyes would drift to some middle distance that none of us could see. Heather Porter was 44 and worked as a wildlife biologist for the State Forestry Division. She had spent years cataloging the fauna of the southern Appalachian wilderness, and she approached the natural world with the detached precision of someone who believed that everything could be measured and classified and understood. Alice Hicks was the last to join. She was 69 and she had known Douglas longer than any of us. They had grown up in the same hollow outside War, West Virginia, and there was a history between them that neither of them ever fully explained. Alice walked with a slight limp from a fall she had taken years earlier, but she never complained, and she never slowed down, and she never once suggested that maybe this trip was not a good idea, even when the rest of us were thinking it. We drove south through Fayette County and then west into the deep folds of the Appalachian Plateau, where the mountains pressed close against the road and the tree canopy closed overhead like the vaulted ceiling of some vast green cathedral. The air changed as we descended. It grew heavier and damper and carried with it a mineral smell that I could not identify at first, but which Douglas recognized immediately. He said it was the smell of old workings, coal dust and standing water and timber that had been underground so long it had begun to rot. He said you never forgot that smell once you had breathed it. He was right about that. We reached the trailhead in the late afternoon. The access road had not been maintained in years, and the last 2 miles required 4-wheel drive and a willingness to accept that your vehicle was going to sustain damage. Douglas did not seem concerned. He parked the truck at the end of the road where the gravel gave way to bare earth and killed the engine and sat for a moment looking out through the windshield at the wall of timber and rhododendron that rose before us. He did not say anything, he just looked. And then he opened the door and stepped out and began unloading gear as though nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. The others arrived in Beverly's station wagon 20 minutes later. We distributed packs and checked supplies and studied the topographic map that Douglas had marked with our intended route. The plan was simple. We would hike 3 miles along the old miners' trail to a clearing near the head of Elkhorn Creek, where Douglas remembered a flat sheltered campsite with good water access. We would spend 4 nights. We would fish and hike and explore the surrounding ridgelines, and we would not think about our jobs or our mortgages or the slow grinding erosion of time against our bodies and our minds. That was the plan. The trail was narrow and overgrown, and in several places it had been swallowed entirely by the encroaching forest. Douglas led the way with a machete, cutting back the worst of the vegetation. I walked behind him. Beverly and Nathan followed. Heather and Alice brought up the rear. We moved slowly. The terrain was steep and the footing was treacherous, loose shale and exposed roots and patches of mud that could send you sliding 20 feet downhill if you placed your weight wrong. But the woods were beautiful. Massive tulip poplars and red oaks towered above us. The understory was thick with ferns and trillium and the pale ghostly stalks of Indian pipe. Somewhere off to our left a creek murmured over stones. The light filtered down through the canopy in long golden shafts, and the air was warm and still and sweet with the scent of decaying leaves. It was the kind of place that made you believe the world was good. It was the kind of place that made you forget. We reached the campsite just before sundown. It was exactly as Douglas had described. A broad, flat clearing ringed by hemlock and white pine with Elkhorn Creek running cold and clear along its northern edge. We set up our tents in a loose semicircle and gathered wood for a fire, and Beverly produced a cast-iron skillet from her pack that must have weighed 5 pounds and cooked a dinner of fried trout and cornbread that was better than anything I had eaten in months. We sat around the fire afterward and talked. Nathan told stories about growing up in the coal camps. Douglas pointed out constellations through gaps in the canopy. Alice hummed old hymns that I half recognized from a childhood I had mostly forgotten. It was good. It was peaceful. It was everything the trip was supposed to be. And then the knocking started. It came from below, not from the trees, not from the ridge above us, not from any direction that made sense on the surface of the earth. It came from underneath. A steady rhythmic tapping. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 knocks, then silence. It sounded exactly like someone striking the head of a hammer against solid rock. Beverly was the first to hear it. She set down her coffee cup and tilted her head and held up one hand for quiet, and we all stopped talking and listened. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It pulsed up through the ground beneath our feet like a heartbeat, like something buried and alive and trying to communicate. Heather said it was probably just thermal contraction in the subsurface rock. She said the old mine tunnels that ran beneath this section of the mountain were subject to temperature fluctuations that could produce exactly this kind of acoustic phenomenon. She said there was nothing unusual about it. She said it in the same calm, measured tone she used when explaining the migratory patterns of cave bats or the feeding habits of timber rattlesnakes. She said it, and then she looked at Nathan, and Nathan was not moving. He was sitting perfectly still with his hands on his knees, and his face had gone the color of old ash. He was staring at the ground. Not at us, at the ground. And his lips were moving, but no sound was coming out, and I realized with a cold, sick lurch in my stomach that he was counting. He was counting the knocks. 3, then silence. 3, then silence. 3, then silence. Nathan finally spoke, and his voice was barely above a whisper. He said his grandfather used to tell him about the knockers. He said the old miners called them Tommy knockers. He said they lived in the deepest parts of the mines where no light had ever reached and no human being had ever set foot. He said they knocked on the walls and the ceilings and the support timbers, and sometimes the knocking was a warning, and sometimes the knocking was an invitation, and you could never tell the difference until it was too late. He said his grandfather told him that if you ever heard the knocking above ground, it meant the Tommy knockers had come up. It meant they had found a way out. It meant they were hungry. Douglas told Nathan to stop. He said Nathan was scaring people with old wives' tales and campfire nonsense. He said there was nothing down there but abandoned tunnels and stagnant water and the rusting remains of equipment that had not been operated since 1978. He said this with the absolute authority of a man who had spent 30 years underground and knew every sound a mine could make. But I noticed that Douglas did not look at the ground when he said it. He looked at the trees. He looked at the sky. He looked anywhere except down. The knocking continued for approximately 40 minutes, and then it stopped. It did not fade. It did not diminish gradually. It simply ceased. One moment it was there, and the next moment it was gone, and the silence that replaced it was somehow worse. We went to bed. Nobody discussed what we had heard. Nobody suggested that maybe we should pack up and hike out in the morning. We just went to our tents and zipped our sleeping bags and lay there in the stillness and listened to the creek and the wind and the slow, restless stirring of the forest at night. I did not sleep. I lay on my back with my eyes open and stared at the nylon ceiling of my tent and felt the ground beneath me and tried not to think about what was underneath that ground. Miles and miles of tunnels, shafts and chambers and passages carved through solid rock by men who were now dead. An entire labyrinth buried beneath the mountain like the skeleton of some enormous creature. And somewhere in that labyrinth, something was knocking. Something was alive. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it was geology. I told myself that Heather was right and that there was a perfectly rational explanation, and that in the morning we would all laugh about it and Nathan's ghost stories and everything would be fine. I told myself all of these things and none of them helped because somewhere around 3 in the morning the knocking started again. And this time it was closer. I did not mention the knocking at breakfast. Nobody did. We moved through the morning routine with the careful, deliberate normalcy of people who have collectively decided not to acknowledge something terrible. Beverly made coffee. Douglas studied the map. Heather recorded observations in her field journal. Nathan sat on a fallen log near the creek and ate his breakfast in silence and did not look at anyone. Alice was the one who finally broke the unspoken agreement. She was standing at the edge of the clearing where the tree line began, and she was looking at the ground. She called us over. There were marks in the earth, not animal tracks, not boot prints. They were small round indentations arranged in clusters of 3, each cluster spaced roughly 18 inches apart, extending in a line from the center of our campsite to the tree line and then beyond, disappearing into the undergrowth on a trajectory that pointed directly toward the old mine entrance that Douglas had mentioned the previous evening. Each indentation was approximately 2 inches in diameter and pressed into the soil with enough force to penetrate the layer of leaf litter and reach the compacted clay beneath. Heather crouched beside the marks and examined them with the focused intensity of someone who has spent their career reading the language written in dirt. She did not say anything for a long time. She traced the edge of one indentation with her fingertip. She measured the spacing between clusters. She followed the line to the tree line, and then she came back and stood up and brushed the soil from her knees and said she did not know what had made them. She said they did not correspond to any animal tracks she had ever seen. She said the force required to create impressions of that depth in soil of that composition was inconsistent with the small diameter of the marks. She said it was as though something very heavy but very small had walked through our camp while we slept. Douglas said he wanted to find the old mine entrance. He said he had been thinking about it all morning. He said the entrance was only about a mile from our campsite along a spur trail that branched off the main path near a distinctive rock formation he called the Pulpit. He said he wanted to see it again. He said he had not been back since he retired, and he wanted to see what condition it was in. He said this in a tone that suggested casual curiosity and nothing more. But his eyes told a different story. His eyes were the eyes of a man who needed to know something. Beverly said she would go with him. Nathan said nothing, but he picked up his pack and fell into line, and that was his answer. Heather wanted to see the mine entrance from a geological perspective. Alice said she had not walked this far to sit in a clearing. I did not want to go. I want to be very clear about that. Every instinct I possessed was telling me to stay at the camp, to sit by the creek and fish and read and wait for the others to come back and pretend that none of this was happening. But I could not let them go without me. I could not sit alone in that clearing knowing what was beneath it. So I packed my gear and I followed them, and I tried not to look at the line of indentations in the earth that pointed the way like an arrow. The spur trail was barely visible. Douglas found it by memory rather than by any physical marker. We pushed through dense stands of rhododendron and crossed 2 shallow tributaries and climbed a steep shale slope that left all of us breathing hard. The forest changed as we ascended. The tulip poplars and oaks gave way to stunted pines and birch, the undergrowth thinned, the soil became rocky and pale, and the smell intensified. That mineral smell, coal dust and iron and something else underneath it. Something organic and wrong. Something that smelled like meat left in a closed room for too long. The Pulpit was a massive sandstone outcrop that jutted from the hillside like the prow of a ship. It was streaked with black seams of exposed coal, and its surface was covered with a thick crust of lichen that gave it a diseased, mottled appearance. Douglas stopped at the base of the outcrop and pointed to a gap in the rock face approximately 30 feet above the trail. It was not large, maybe 4 feet high and 6 feet wide. A rough arch of crumbling sandstone framed by rusted iron bolts where a gate or a grate had once been mounted. The old entrance to the Elkhorn Creek No. 7 mine. The opening was partially blocked by a collapse of loose rock and soil, but there was a gap at the top, maybe 2 feet of clearance, that was large enough for a person to crawl through. A steady current of air flowed from the opening. It was cold, much colder than the ambient temperature, and it carried that smell, that deep underground smell of things that had been sealed away from the sun for decades. Nathan stopped walking. He stood about 20 feet from the entrance, and he would not go any closer. He said he could hear them. He said the knocking was coming from inside the mine. I listened. At first I heard nothing except the wind moving through the pines and the distant sound of water running over rock. But then I heard it, faint, rhythmic, 3 knocks, then silence, 3 knocks, then silence, coming from the throat of the mine like the pulse of something enormous buried in the mountain. Beverly heard it too. I could see it in the way she gripped her walking stick. Her knuckles were white, her jaw was set, she was afraid. Beverly Stevens, who had hiked alone through bear country and rattlesnake dens and ice storms that would have killed a lesser person, was afraid. Douglas approached the entrance. He climbed the loose scree slope with the practiced ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times before, and he stood at the lip of the opening, and he looked inside. He stood there for a long time. The cold air from the mine moved around him like a current. It stirred his hair and pressed his shirt flat against his chest. He did not speak. He did not move. He just looked into that opening with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was not fear. It was recognition. It was the face of a man who was seeing something he had spent 6 years trying to forget. When he came back down the slope, his face was gray and his hands were shaking. He said the mine was open. He said the main drift extended at least 100 yards before it curved out of sight. He said the timbers were still standing. He said the rails were still in the floor. He said everything looked exactly the way it had looked when the mine was sealed in 1978. He said nothing should look like that. He said 48 years of water infiltration and ground movement and biological decay should have reduced the interior to rubble. He said the fact that it had not was wrong. He said it was deeply and fundamentally wrong. Heather asked if he had seen anything moving inside. Douglas did not answer immediately. He sat down on a rock and he took off his hat and he ran his hand through his hair and he looked at the ground between his feet. Then he said yes. He said he had seen something. He said it was small, about the size of a child. It had been standing in the drift about 60 feet from the entrance, just at the edge of where the daylight reached. It was standing perfectly still, and it was facing him. He said he could not make out details because the light was bad. He said it looked like it was made of stone, like a figure carved from coal, but it was breathing. He could see its chest moving. It was breathing and it was watching him, and when he looked directly at it, it opened its mouth and he heard the knocking sound come from its throat. Not from the walls, not from the ceiling, from its throat. 3 knocks. Then it closed its mouth. Then 3 more knocks. Alice said we needed to leave. She said it plainly and without emotion. She said we needed to go back to the campsite and pack our gear and hike out to the trailhead and drive home and never come back. She said this mountain did not belong to us. She said it belonged to them. She said them in a way that made the word sound like a door closing. Nathan agreed. He said his grandfather had told him what happened to people who did not listen to the knocking. He said they went underground. He said the Tommyknockers took them underground, and they never came back, and sometimes you could hear them knocking in the deep places for years afterward. Knocking and knocking and knocking, trying to find their way out, trying to tell the living that they were still down there, still conscious, still aware, still trapped in the perpetual black beneath millions of tons of rock. He said his grandfather had lost 2 brothers that way, not to cave-ins, not to gas, to the knockers. He said the company records listed them as missing. He said the families knew better. Douglas said we were not leaving. His voice had changed. The casual confidence was gone. In its place was something harder and more desperate. He said he had been hearing the knocking for 6 years. He said it followed him home from the mine. He said he heard it in his walls at night, in his floor, in his foundation. He said it was getting louder every year. He said he came back because he needed to understand what they wanted. He said he needed to go inside. The argument lasted nearly an hour. Beverly tried to reason with him. Alice tried to order him. Heather cited statistics about the structural failure rates of abandoned mine workings and the lethal concentrations of methane and carbon monoxide that accumulated in sealed shafts. None of it mattered. Douglas was going in. He said we could wait for him, or we could leave, but he was going in, and nothing anyone said was going to change that. In the end, we waited. We sat on the rocks below the pulpit. and we watched Douglas climb back up to the entrance and squeeze through the gap in the collapse and disappear into the mountain. The cold air from the mine swallowed him. One moment he was there, a solid physical man with broad shoulders and calloused hands and a persistent cough, and the next moment he was gone, absorbed, consumed by the opening in the rock as though the mountain had simply closed its mouth around him. We waited, 30 minutes, an hour. The sun moved across the sky and the shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped, and we waited. Beverly called his name every 10 minutes. Her voice echoed off the sandstone and disappeared into the mine entrance, and nothing came back. Not a reply, not a shout, not even an echo. The mountain ate her voice the same way it had eaten Douglas. At the 90-minute mark, Nathan said we needed to accept that Douglas was not coming back. He said it quietly and without surprise, as though he had known from the beginning that this was how the day would end. He said we should go back to camp and gather our things and leave while we still had daylight. He said the Tommyknockers had what they wanted. He said we should not give them anything more. But then we heard it, Douglas's voice, coming from inside the mine, faint and distorted and echoing strangely off the walls of the drift. He was calling for help. He was saying he had fallen. He was saying he could not move. He was saying, please, please come help me. Please do not leave me down here alone. Beverly was on her feet immediately. She started toward the entrance. Nathan grabbed her arm and held her back, and the sound he made was not a word. It was a sound I have never heard a human being produce before or since. A low, keening moan of absolute primal terror. He said that was not Douglas. He said listen to it. He said listen to the rhythm. Listen to how the words are spaced. 3 syllables, then silence. 3 syllables, then silence. 3 syllables, then silence. Help me please. Pause. Help me please. Pause. Help me please. Pause. It was the knocking, the same pattern. 3 and then silence. 3 and then silence. But now it was using Douglas's voice. Now it was wearing his words like a mask. Beverly stopped. She stood at the base of the slope and she listened, and the color drained from her face, and she took one step backward and then another, and then she turned and walked back to where we were standing, and she did not say a word. We left the pulpit. We left Douglas. We walked back down the spur trail in silence, and we did not look behind us, and we tried not to hear the voice that followed us through the trees, calling and calling in a rhythm that was not human, in a cadence that belonged to something that had learned the shape of language but not its meaning. 3 syllables. Then silence. All the way back to camp. All the way back. We reached the campsite at dusk. The fire had burned down to white ash. Our tents stood in their loose semicircle exactly as we had left them. Everything looked normal. Everything looked safe. It was a lie. The indentations in the soil had multiplied. They were everywhere now. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They covered the clearing in dense, overlapping clusters that radiated outward from a central point near the fire pit. They covered the ground around our tents. They covered the paths to the creek. They covered every square foot of exposed earth as though an army of small, heavy figures had marched through the camp while we were gone, circling and circling in patterns that made no geometric sense. Alice knelt beside one of the clusters and traced the marks with her fingers, and then she pressed her ear to the ground, and she stayed that way for a long time. When she lifted her head, her eyes were wet. She said she could hear them underneath. She said there were many of them. She said they were close, very close, just beneath the surface. She said they were waiting. Heather wanted to be rational. I could see her fighting for it, clinging to the framework of logic and evidence and empirical observation that had defined her entire professional life. She said subsurface subsidence in abandoned mineworks could produce ground-level deformations that might resemble tracks. She said auditory hallucinations were a documented response to prolonged stress in wilderness settings. She said there were explanations. There were always explanations. She said this while standing in a clearing full of impossible tracks, with the sound of rhythmic knocking rising up through the soles of her boots, and I watched her voice break on the last word, and I watched the rationality drain from her face like water from a cracked vessel, and what was left underneath was the same thing that was in all of us. Fear. Not the manageable fear of a known threat. Not the productive fear that sharpens your senses and focuses your mind. This was the old fear, the ancestral fear. The fear that lives in the deepest part of the brain where language has never reached. The fear of what lives below. We packed. We moved fast, and we moved sloppy, and we left things behind that we should have taken. Cooking gear, chairs, a cooler full of food. None of it mattered. What mattered was getting our packs on our backs, and getting to the trail, and getting down the mountain before the last of the light bled out of the sky. Nathan led the way. He moved with a speed and sureness that seemed impossible for a man of his age. He knew this terrain. He had walked it as a child. He had walked it with his grandfather. He had walked it in nightmares for 60 years. Beverly stayed close behind him, then Heather, then Alice. I brought up the rear. I did not want to be last. I did not want to be the one with nothing behind me but shadow and silence and the growing certainty that something was following us. But someone had to be last, and I was the youngest and the strongest, and so I was last, and I walked backward as much as forward, and I watched the trail behind us, and I listened. The knocking had changed. It was no longer rhythmic. It was no longer the steady measured three in silence that we had heard the previous night. It was erratic, frantic. It came from all directions at once, from below and behind and above, and it seemed to be gaining speed like a heartbeat accelerating toward some terrible climax. And there were other sounds now. Scratching, clawing, the sound of small hard things moving through loose earth, the sound of digging, coming from beneath the trail, coming from beneath our feet as we walked, moving with us, keeping pace. It was Beverly who fell first. The trail gave way beneath her right foot. Not a stumble, not a trip over a root. The ground itself collapsed. A hole opened in the trail maybe 2 feet wide, and Beverly's leg went through it, up to the knee, and she cried out, and Nathan turned and grabbed her arms and pulled, and for a moment she did not move. For a moment something beneath the trail was holding her foot. I could see it in her face. The surprise, and then the horror, and then the desperate scrambling panic of a woman who understood that something underground had her and was not letting go. Nathan pulled harder. Alice grabbed Beverly's pack. Heather braced Nathan from behind. I heard the sound of fabric tearing, and Beverly screamed, and then she was free, and Nathan was dragging her backward, and her boot was gone, and her sock was gone, and her foot was scratched and bleeding, and covered in a thick black paste that looked like coal dust mixed with something wet. She was shaking. Her whole body was vibrating with adrenaline and terror, and she could not speak. She pointed at the hole in the trail. We looked. The hole was not a collapse. It was a tunnel. A narrow vertical shaft that dropped straight down into a blackness so complete that our flashlight beams disappeared into it without touching bottom. The walls of the shaft were smooth, not rough and broken like a natural sinkhole, smooth, as though something had carved them, as though something had dug this hole from below with patient, deliberate precision, carving upward through clay and shale and root, aiming for the exact spot where Beverly's foot would land. And from the bottom of that shaft, rising up through yards and yards of solid earth, came the knocking. 3, then silence. 3, then silence. We ran. There is no other word for it. We abandoned any pretense of careful hiking. We ran down that trail in the failing light, with our packs bouncing and our feet sliding on loose rock and our lungs burning, and we did not stop. We did not look back. We did not think about Douglas. We could not afford to think about Douglas. The holes opened ahead of us, 2 more on the trail, then 3, then 5. Small circular shafts that appeared in the earth with no warning, punching up through the surface like fists through paper. We dodged them. We leaped over them. We crashed through the undergrowth on either side of the trail to avoid them. And from each one came the knocking, louder now, insistent, hungry, and from some of them came voices. Douglas's voice, and other voices. Voices I did not recognize. Old voices, tired voices. Voices that spoke in the cadence of the knocking. 3 syllables, then silence. 3 syllables, then silence. Saying words that almost made sense, but not quite. Saying names, our names, my name. Spoken from beneath the earth in a rhythm that was not human by throats that had forgotten what humanity sounded like. Nathan fell. His age caught up with him on a steep descent where the trail switchbacked across a wash of loose shale. His feet went out from under him, and he slid 15 feet downhill on his back, and he hit a boulder with his left shoulder, and I heard something crack, and he cried out, and then he was still. I scrambled down to him. Alice was already there. Nathan was conscious, but his face was twisted with pain, and his left arm was hanging at a wrong angle. He could not carry his pack. He could barely stand. Alice got under his right arm, and I got under his left, and we half carried him down the slope, and he groaned with every step, and the knocking followed us, relentless, rising up through the mountain like applause. Heather was ahead of us with Beverly. Beverly was limping badly. Her injured foot was swelling, and every step drew a sharp intake of breath that sounded like a sob. Heather had Beverly's arm over her shoulder and was practically dragging her, and they were both moving too slowly, and the trail was still 1.5 miles from the trailhead, and the light was almost gone. And then I saw them, not one. Not the single figure that Douglas had described in the mine entrance. Dozens. They were standing in the trees on either side of the trail, small figures, no taller than children, but they were not children. They were the color of anthracite, black and gleaming and faceted like raw crystal. Their bodies were dense and compact, and they stood with a stillness that no living creature should possess. They had faces, but the faces were wrong. The features were approximations, rough suggestions of eyes and mouths carved into surfaces that were never meant to hold expression. And they were watching us. Every single one of them was facing the trail and watching us with those crude carved eyes, and their mouths were moving, opening and closing, in unison, in rhythm. 3, then silence. 3, then silence. The sound came from all of them at once, and it was not knocking anymore. It was something else, something that lived in the space between sound and silence, between hearing and feeling, between the world above and the world below. It went through me like a current. It vibrated in my teeth and my bones and the fluid in my inner ear, and I felt my sense of balance shift, and the ground seemed to tilt, and for one terrible moment I was not sure which direction was down. Nathan saw them too. He made that sound again, that keening moan, and then he said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, however long or short that proves to be. He said they were the miners. He said the Tommyknockers were the miners, the men who went into the mountain and never came out, his grandfather's brothers, and all the others. All the men swallowed by the Elkhorn Creek mines over 100 years of operation. They did not die, they changed. The mountain took them, and it changed them, and they became part of it. Coal and stone, and something that was neither alive nor deceased but existed in a state between the two, conscious and hungry and patient in the way that only geological time can be patient. He said they knocked because they remembered. Somewhere in what was left of their minds they remembered being human. They remembered communication. They remembered language. But they had been underground so long that the memory had degraded, compressed, reduced to its most basic element. 3 knocks, the simplest possible message. I am here, I am here, I am here. And they took people because they were lonely, because the only thing worse than being trapped in eternal awareness beneath millions of tons of rock was being trapped there alone. We did not stop moving. We could not. The figures in the trees did not approach us, but they were always there, paralleling our course through the timber, their mouths opening and closing in that terrible synchronous rhythm. The holes continued to open in the trail. Some of them were larger now, 3 feet wide, 4. The earth was becoming unstable. I could feel it shifting and settling beneath my boots, as though the entire surface layer was being undermined from below, honeycombed with tunnels and shafts and chambers, the mountain hollowing itself out to receive us. Alice fell behind. I did not notice at first. I was focused on Nathan and on the trail and on the figures in the trees and on keeping my own feet from finding one of those holes. It was Heather who called out. She turned and looked back, and Alice was not there. She had been behind us. She had been right behind us. And now she was not. I stopped. I turned. The trail behind us was empty. The figures in the trees were still there, motionless, watching. The knocking continued, but Alice was gone. No scream, no cry for help, no sound of a fall or a struggle. She had simply vanished from the line as though she had been extracted, as though something had reached up from beneath the trail and pulled her down so quickly and so quietly that none of us had noticed. I wanted to go back. I want that recorded. I wanted to go back for her. But Nathan's hand closed on my arm with a strength that should not have been possible for an injured 71-year-old man, and he said, "Do not stop." He said, "If you stop, they will take you." He said the only thing keeping us alive was movement. The Tommyknockers could not take you if you kept moving. They could only take you if you stopped, if you stood still long enough for the ground beneath you to open, if you paused long enough for those small, dense hands to reach up through the earth and close around your ankles and pull you down into the labyrinth that waited below. So we did not stop. We kept moving. We dragged each other down that mountain in the gathering gloom, with the knocking rising around us like a tide, and the figures watching from the trees and the ground softening and shifting beneath our feet, and we did not stop. Not when Beverly collapsed and Heather had to lift her onto her back and carry her. Not when Nathan's breathing became a wet, rattling sound that echoed the knocking in a way that made my skin crawl. Not when I heard Alice's voice calling to us from underground. 3 syllables, then silence. 3 syllables, then silence. Already learning the rhythm. Already becoming one of them. We reached the trailhead at full nightfall. The truck and the station wagon were still there. The parking area was solid, paved, no earth for them to dig through. I got Nathan into the truck. Heather got Beverly into the station wagon. We drove. We did not speak. We did not look at the tree line. We drove out of that hollow and down the access road and onto the county highway, and we did not stop until we reached the gas station an eager 14 miles away. We sat in the fluorescent brightness of that gas station parking lot, and we breathed, and we shook, and we tried to remember how to be people who lived on the surface of the earth instead of prey for what lived beneath it. Beverly went to a hospital in Welch. Her foot required 12 stitches. Nathan's shoulder was dislocated and fractured. Heather filed a report with the county sheriff about Douglas and Alice. The report listed them as missing hikers, lost in the backcountry. Probable cause of disappearance, the report said, was a fall or exposure or disorientation. That was the official story. The official story did not mention the knocking. It did not mention the tracks. It did not mention the figures in the trees, or the holes in the trail, or the voice that called from underground in a rhythm that was 3 and then silence, 3 and then silence, forever and ever beneath the mountain. I have told you what happened. I have told you what I saw, and what I heard, and what I believe. I understand that you will likely dismiss it. I understand that you will look for rational explanations, thermal contraction, subsidence, hysteria. I looked for those explanations too. I looked for them for months. And then one night in August, 2 months after we came down from that mountain, I was lying in bed in my apartment in Charleston, and I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, coming from the floor beneath my bed. 3 knocks, then silence, 3 knocks, then silence, 3 knocks, then silence. They found me, they followed me home, and the knocking is getting louder. Every night it is a little louder, a little closer. I can feel the floor shifting when I stand still too long. I can feel the vibration in my feet. I have started sleeping in different places, hotels, friends' couches, my car, because Nathan told me the truth. They can only take you if you stop moving. They can only take you if you stand still. So I do not stand still. I keep moving. I drive. I walk. I pace the floors of 24-hour diners and all-night laundromats, and I do not sit down, and I do not close my eyes, and I do not stop. Not ever, not for a moment, because they are under me, right now, right beneath me, wherever I go, whatever surface I stand on. They are there, waiting. Knocking. 3, then silence. 3, then silence. I am here. I am here. I am here. If you are hearing this, do me one kindness. Do not go to the mountains. Do not go to the old coal country. Do not stand still on ground where miners once walked and were swallowed and were changed into things that knock in the deep places of the earth. Because they are listening. They are always listening. And they are so very lonely. And they will take you down. 3 knocks, then silence. I am still moving. There are places in this world where the land itself feels hostile, where the trees grow so thick and so close together that sunlight becomes a rumor and silence becomes something that presses against your ears like a living weight. I found one of those places in the summer of 2019, tucked deep into the folds of eastern Kentucky, where the ridges of Appalachia stack up against each other like the spines of ancient sleeping animals, and the hollers between them hold secrets that nobody with any sense would go looking for. I was 48 years old that June, and I had spent most of my adult life believing that the wilderness was a place of peace, a refuge from the noise and cruelty of the civilized world. That belief died in those mountains. It died screaming, and something else was born in its place, something cold and permanent that sits behind my ribs even now, and tightens whenever I hear a branch snap in my own backyard. I need to tell you what happened out there, not because I think anyone will believe me, but because the 5 people who walked into that holler with me deserve to have their story told by someone who saw it, someone who carried the weight of what we witnessed all the way back to the world of pavement and electric light. Some of them did not come back whole. Some of them left pieces of themselves in those mountains that they will never recover. I still hear them at night when the wind moves through the trees behind my house, and I have to remind myself that I am home, that the thing in the holler cannot reach me here. But I am not always convinced. We had organized the trip through an online forum for backcountry hiking enthusiasts. A week of primitive camping and trail hiking in a remote section of Pine Mountain in Letcher County, Kentucky, far from established campgrounds, far from cell service, far from anything resembling the modern world. The post was written by Nicole Henry, 35, an experienced trail guide who had logged thousands of miles across the Appalachian range, and who spoke about the mountains the way some people speak about cathedrals. She described a route through old-growth forest and along ridgelines where you could see 3 states on a clear day, down into hollers where the creeks ran cold and clean over beds of ancient limestone. The photographs she posted were stunning, all green ridges and misty valleys and creeks that looked like liquid glass, and they made you believe that the mountains were a sanctuary, a place where the worst of the world could not follow you. That was the lie the mountains told, and we believed it completely. Carl Morales responded first. 61 years old, retired from the army, built like a man who had never stopped training. Carl did not talk much, but when he did, his words carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen difficult things and survived them through discipline. He said he wanted to see the old forests before his knees gave out entirely, and you understood he was not joking. Rose Kennedy signed up next, 58, a retired schoolteacher from Lexington who had taken up hiking after her husband passed. Rose had a warmth that came through even in text, a gentle humor and a genuine curiosity about the natural world. She said she had always wanted to explore the deep hollers of eastern Kentucky, the places her grandmother had told stories about when Rose was a girl sitting on a porch in the summer heat. Stories about things that lived in the laurel thickets and came out only when the fog rolled in. Stories told in a low voice with the windows shut, even in August, as though the old woman feared that something outside might hear its name spoken and come to the door. Harold Boyd was 75 and had no business being on a backcountry hiking trip, and he knew it, and he did not care. He was a former coal miner from Harlan County who had spent 40 years underground and who said the mountains owed him a view from the top. Harold walked with a slight limp from an old injury, but his grip was like iron and his eyes were sharper than anyone half his age. He knew these mountains. When he spoke about the hollers, there was a reverence in his voice, but also a caution I did not fully understand until later. Samantha Mason was 40, a photographer from Nashville who specialized in wilderness landscapes. She carried 2 cameras and spoke about light, the way Nicole spoke about trails, with a precision that could shift without warning into something almost spiritual. Samantha was quiet and watchful, the kind of person who noticed things other people walked right past. That quality would prove both a blessing and a curse. And then there was me. Peter Crawford, 48, a high school history teacher from Louisville with a love of the outdoors and a belief, soon to be shattered, that the worst thing you could encounter in the Kentucky wilderness was a black bear with a bad attitude. We met in person at a gas station in Whitesburg on a Monday morning in late June. The mountains rose around the little town like green walls, their tops lost in a haze that turned the sky the color of old pewter. Nicole spread a topographic map across the hood of her truck and walked us through the route. We would drive 40 minutes east to a trailhead, then hike 6 miles into the backcountry to a campsite beside a creek in a holler called Dismal Branch. The name should have been a warning. She pointed to the contour lines on the map, and I noticed Harold leaning in close. He placed one thick finger on a spot where the contour lines bunched together so tightly they nearly merged. "That there is Slaughter Fork," he said. His voice was low and even. "We do not want to go near Slaughter Fork." Nicole asked why. Harold straightened up and looked at each of us in turn. "Because my grandfather told me not to," he said, "and his grandfather told him the same, and that is all I will say about it." Nobody pressed him. Nicole adjusted the route, adding a half-mile to steer us further from the drainage Harold had indicated, and we drove east into the mountains. The road narrowed as we climbed, paved giving way to gravel, gravel giving way to dirt, the trees closing in overhead until we were driving through a green tunnel that swallowed the daylight. We parked at a rusted gate and started hiking. The trail was just a faint line of compressed earth winding through forest, so dense that visibility rarely exceeded 30 yards. The canopy overhead was a solid mat of green, and beneath it the air was cool and heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. There was a stillness to the forest that went beyond mere quiet. It was the stillness of a held breath, of a room where someone is hiding and trying not to be found. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself the mountains were just mountains, indifferent stone and ancient wood, incapable of intent. I was wrong about that too. We reached Dismal Branch around 3 in the afternoon. The holler was a narrow valley carved by a creek that ran clear over rounded stones, with steep ridges rising on either side and old tulip poplars standing like columns along the water. We set up camp on a flat bench above the creek, and by 5 o'clock we had a fire going and the first meal cooking. I remember sitting on a log with a cup of coffee, watching the light fade from gold to a deep bruised violet as the sun dropped behind the ridge, and thinking this was exactly what I had needed, this silence, this simplicity, this sense of being held inside something ancient and immeasurably larger than myself. Rose was telling a story about a hike she had done with her late husband in the Smokies, and her voice was warm and easy, and the fire threw soft light across faces that looked content and unburdened. It felt safe. Remember that feeling, because it was the last time any of us would know it. The first thing I noticed was the quiet, not the peaceful quiet of a forest settling into evening, something emptier. By the time full night arrived, I realized I had not heard a single bird since we entered the holler. No whippoorwills, no owls, no nightjars. The creek murmured and the fire popped. But beyond those small noises there was nothing, just a vast, absorbing silence that pressed in from the ridges like the walls of a narrowing corridor. Harold noticed it too. He sat across the fire, his eyes not on the flames but on the tree line, scanning the wall of shadow beyond the firelight with an attention that made my stomach tighten. "Everything all right, Harold?" Rose asked. He tilted his head, as though listening for something specific. "Just an old habit," he said. "Old miners listen for things that are not there. It is how we stay alive." Carl looked up from his map. He did not say anything, but I saw his right hand move to the sheath knife on his belt, a reflex that spoke of years of training. I crawled into my tent around 10 and lay listening. The creek ran, the embers ticked, and somewhere out in the forest surrounding our camp, I heard a sound I could not identify, a low, resonant vocalization that was not a coyote, and not a bear, and not any animal I had ever encountered. It rose and fell over 3 seconds, a sound from a chest far larger than any creature in these woods had any right to possess. The sound moved through the trees and through the walls of my tent and through the bones of my skull, and it carried with it a quality I can only describe as authority, the absolute, unchallengeable authority of something that rules its territory without rival. Then it stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, because silence in a place like that does not mean nothing is there. It means whatever is there has decided to be quiet, and a predator that chooses silence is a predator that is listening. Morning came gray and cool, with clouds sitting on the ridge-tops like a lid pressed over the holler. I had slept poorly. When I stepped out, Harold was already sitting by the fire ring, feeding sticks into coals he had coaxed back to life. He looked like he had not slept at all. "Did you hear it?" he said without looking up. It was not a question. He built the fire carefully, then looked at me across the smoke. "That sound," he said, "I heard it once before. I was 12, hunting with my grandfather up on Pound Mountain. We set up a blind near a salt lick, and just before dawn something walked past us in the laurel. Something big, bigger than a bear. My grandfather grabbed my arm so hard he left bruises and told me not to move, not to breathe. Then we heard it, that same sound. And my grandfather, who was the hardest man I ever knew, who survived 2 wars and 40 years underground, was shaking. When it was gone, he packed our gear, and we walked out, and he never went back. When I asked him what it was, he said there was something in the deep hollers, something that was not a bear, and not a cat, and not anything with a name people used in polite conversation. He called it the beast. He said his people had known about it for as long as they had lived in these mountains, and the only thing you needed to know was that you did not go looking for it, and if it came looking for you, then God help you, because nothing else would. We ate breakfast and started up the ridge trail toward the fire tower. The cloud cover pressed low, turning the world beneath the canopy into a twilight realm of gray-green light. Nicole led with her usual stride, but I noticed she was checking her compass more frequently than seemed necessary. Carl walked beside me and leaned close. "Crawford," he said, "that sound last night. I have heard a lot of animals in a lot of places, jungles and deserts and mountains on 4 continents. That did not come from any animal I have ever encountered, and I do not like things I cannot identify." We hiked for 2 hours, the understory thickening into walls of mountain laurel and rhododendron so dense you could not see more than a few feet. It was there that Samantha stopped. She called out to Nicole in a carefully controlled voice that carried an undertone of something that made all of us turn. "There is something in the laurel," she said. She was pointing to the right of the trail, into a wall of glossy green leaves. I did not see anything. Then Rose drew a sharp breath. Deep in the laurel, perhaps 20 feet from the trail, there was a shape. It was not moving. It was simply standing there, watching us. The shape was upright, bipedal. It stood at least 7 feet tall, broad shoulders impossibly wide for a human frame. Arms that hung past where the waist should have been. A head set forward on the neck at an angle that suggested a spine built for different locomotion, and eyes. They caught the dim light and reflected it with a faint, oily sheen. They were set forward in the skull, spaced like a predator's, and they were fixed on us with an intelligence that went beyond animal awareness into something far more unsettling, a calculating, patient regard that said, "I see you, I know what you are, and I am deciding what to do about it." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The air felt thick, as though the atmosphere itself had congealed around us, trapping us in a moment that stretched far beyond its natural duration. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast and desperately mortal, and I was certain the thing in the laurel could hear it too. Then the shape shifted, a slight redistribution of weight, a turning of that massive head, and the laurel branches moved in a way that revealed its sheer mass. The branches, thick woody stems that would resist a human push, bent away from this creature like grass before a passing boulder. Harold spoke one word, spoken quietly, without inflection, carrying nothing except absolute certainty. "Go." We went. Nicole turned and started up the trail at a pace just short of running. I looked back once, about 50 yards up the slope. The shape was gone. The laurel stood undisturbed, as though nothing had ever been among its leaves. We reached the fire tower in another hour, a rusted steel structure with its cab missing most of its windows. Nobody climbed it. We sat at its base and did not speak for a long time. If you have ever been in a situation where a group of adults realizes they have encountered something outside their understanding of the world, you know the particular quality of silence that follows. It is not shock exactly. It is cognitive vertigo, the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff you did not know was there. Nicole said it was probably a bear standing on its hind legs. It was a reasonable explanation, and not one of us believed it. Carl sat with his back against the tower's steel leg, his knife out, turning it slowly. Samantha had taken her camera out when we first saw the shape, but had not raised it. She told me later her hands had been shaking too badly, and some part of her, some old and primal part that predated language, had told her not to point anything at it, not to do anything that might be interpreted as a challenge. We returned to camp by a different route. Something had been there. Our tents stood where we had left them, but our food bags, which Nicole had hung from a high branch using bear bag protocol, were gone. Not torn open and scattered the way a bear would leave them. Gone. The rope hung limp and empty, its end frayed as though something had pulled the bags down with enough force to snap the cord. No scraps, no wrappers, taken cleanly, as though removed by hands that understood the concept of theft. I looked at the frayed end of the rope and thought about the strength required to snap paracord rated for 500 pounds. And then I looked at the forest around us and felt the holler shrink, felt the ridges lean inward, felt the ancient trees close ranks like soldiers forming a perimeter around something they had been assigned to guard. "We have about 2 days of emergency rations," Nicole said. "We need to decide whether to stay or hike out tomorrow." "We should leave," Harold said, "tonight." Rose looked at him. "Hike out in the pitch black?" "There are worse things than walking in the night," Harold said. Carl stepped forward. "We are not going anywhere in poor visibility through terrain we do not know well. We stay tonight, keep a watch rotation, and leave at first light." We divided the night into shifts. We built the fire high, stacking green logs to create a wall of flame that pushed back the shadows. Beyond that circle, the forest was absolute, not merely without light, but a presence, a solid wall that seemed to lean toward the fire like a living thing pressing against a window. I took my shift at midnight. Carl woke me with a hand on my shoulder and a single whispered word: "Listen." I lay still, heart hammering. At first only the creak and the fire, then faintly, from somewhere up on the ridge, footsteps, not the padding of a deer or the shuffling of a bear, bipedal, heavy and deliberate, moving along the ridge with a stride length that suggested legs far longer than a human possesses. They moved from south to north, unhurried, measured, the footfalls of something that had no reason to rush because nothing in these mountains could threaten it. And as they passed the point directly above our camp, they paused. The silence during that pause was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I could feel a tension in that silence, a vast and focused awareness directed downward through the trees and the slope and the thin membrane of my tent, settling over me like a hand pressed flat against my chest. Then the footsteps resumed, continuing north along the ridge, growing fainter, and I did not exhale until they had been gone for a full minute. Carl handed me his flashlight and his knife. "Keep the fire burning," he said. "Do not leave the light. And if you hear it come down off that ridge, wake everyone. Because if that thing comes into this holler, we run, and we do not stop." I kept the fire burning, feeding it every stick within the circle of light. I wanted it to be a bear. I wanted it to be a person. I wanted it to be anything I could name, anything that fit within the world as I understood it. But the shape in the laurel had not been a bear. The footsteps on the ridge had not belonged to a person, and the vocalization from the first night had not come from any catalogued species. My shift ended without incident. I woke Nicole and lay in my tent, staring at the ceiling, listening with desperate vigilance. The creak, the fire, the wind. Normal sounds, but beneath them, threading through them like a current beneath a river's surface, there was something else, a vibration at the edge of perception, as though the mountain itself were humming a note pitched too low for human ears. Dawn arrived like a reprieve. The clouds had broken, and thin shafts of sunlight came down through the canopy in long golden columns. It would have been beautiful if I had been capable of appreciating beauty, but the past 36 hours had stripped that capacity from me and replaced it with a raw hyper-awareness that turned every shadow into a threat. We packed in silence. Nicole moved with grim efficiency. Carl helped Rose with her pack. Harold stood at the edge of the clearing, facing the ridge, head tilted in that listening posture I had come to recognize. Samantha loaded her cameras without photographing anything. That detail told me how frightened she was. We started hiking out at 6:30. Nicole set an aggressive pace up the slope, leading out of the holler and onto the ridgeline trail. The forest was different in morning light, but the silence persisted. No birds, no squirrels, no insects. The forest had been emptied, its small inhabitants driven away by the presence of something so far above them on the food chain that their only response was to become invisible. We had been hiking about an hour when Harold stopped. He held up one hand, and the gesture was so sudden that all of us froze as though he had pulled a wire connected to our spines. Something was standing in the trail ahead of us. Perhaps 60 yards away, at a point where the trail curved around thick hemlock, it was not hiding. It stood in the open, in the pale morning sunlight, looking directly at us. I will describe it as clearly as I can, because the details have been burned into my memory with a permanence that nothing will diminish. It stood upright on two legs, but its posture was not human. Its torso tilted forward, and its arms, enormously long, hung with the hands reaching past the knees. Its body was covered in coarse, matted hair, a dirty grayish-brown, the color of dead leaves and old bark. Through the hair I could see heavy muscle moving beneath skin that looked thick and tough, like hide built to withstand impacts. Its head was massive, set forward on shoulders that sloped to a point suggesting a sagittal crest, the bony ridge that anchors the jaw muscles of great apes. Its face was flat with a heavy brow ridge, a broad nose, and a mouth slightly open, revealing teeth that were not the flat, grinding teeth of an herbivore but something more predatory. And its eyes held an intelligence that was not animal and not human but something parallel, a mind that could plan, evaluate, and make decisions. Those eyes looked at us the way a chess player looks at a board, not with anger, not with hunger, but with calculating attention several moves ahead. It stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe closer to 9. Its weight was immense. I could see it in the way the ground seemed to yield slightly beneath its feet, in the way its body occupied space with a density and permanence that made the trees around it look fragile. In the filtered sunlight, with the hemlocks behind it and the mountain falling away on either side, it looked like something that had been part of these mountains since before humans arrived. Something that had watched us come and spread and build and burn, and had decided, for reasons of its own, to remain hidden in the deep places where people feared to go. Rose made a sound, not a scream, a small, involuntary exhalation from the deepest part of the survival instinct. That sound triggered it. The creature moved to the side, stepping off the trail into the forest with a fluidity impossible for something its size. One moment it was there, solid and undeniable. The next it was gone, melted into the trees like smoke. But I could hear it. We all could. It was moving through the forest parallel to the trail, pacing us. Branches cracked, undergrowth rustled. The sound of its passage was a wave of disturbance that moved alongside us, always at the same distance. Nicole said one word: run. We ran with blind, adrenaline-fueled desperation, crashing through underbrush, stumbling over roots, sliding on loose shale, our packs bouncing on our backs and our breath tearing out of our lungs in ragged gasps that tasted like copper. There was no dignity in it. There was no strategy. There was only the oldest command in the human nervous system, the one that fires when the body knows it has been chosen as prey. Carl ran beside Rose, one hand gripping her arm. Harold ran with determination that defied his age, his face set in fierce, concentrated will. Samantha ran at the back. That was where it happened. I heard her fall, the heavy thud, the clatter of camera equipment, a sharp cry of pain. She was on the ground, her left ankle twisted at an angle that told me it was broken. She was trying to stand, hands scrabbling at the dirt. And behind her, perhaps 30 yards back, the creature had stopped. It stood at the edge of a rhododendron thicket, half hidden by glossy leaves, watching her with an attention I can only describe as predatory interest. Not hunger, something worse, curiosity. Carl was there before I could move. He hauled Samantha up and got her arm over his shoulder, and then we were moving again. Slower. Samantha hopping on one leg, Carl bearing most of her weight, Harold and I flanking them. The creature followed. It followed us for 2 miles. 2 miles of stumbling, gasping progress through forest that conspired against us, roots reaching up, branches slapping, the slope tilting at angles that turned every step into a battle. The creature kept its distance, 30 to 40 yards, close enough to see, close enough to hear, close enough to remind us it was choosing to let us go, and that this choice could be revoked at any moment. Harold was the one who figured it out. He stopped and turned to face the forest where the creature moved, and he raised both hands, palms out, in a gesture older than language. It was the gesture of a man showing he was unarmed, asking for passage. Then he spoke, not to us, but to the thing in the trees. His voice was low and steady. "We are leaving. We are leaving your mountain. We will not come back. We do not mean you harm. Let us go." The sound of the creature's passage stopped. The silence that followed was charged with a decision being made by an intelligence I could not comprehend. Then from deep in the laurel came the sound. That sound, rising and falling over 4 seconds, not a roar and not a howl, but something containing elements of both, from a throat evolved for a purpose I did not want to understand. Harold lowered his hands. His face was wet. He was crying. Not from fear, from the enormity of standing before something that should not exist but did, something that had outlived every attempt to deny it, something as real as the stone beneath our feet, and as old as the stories that had kept his people away from the deep hollers for generations beyond counting. I understood in that moment that Harold had spent his entire life carrying the weight of what his grandfather had shown him on Pound Mountain, carrying it alone because no one would have believed him, and that standing here now, with 5 witnesses beside him, was both a vindication and a grief. "Let us go," he said again, almost a whisper. The creature vocalized once more, shorter, lower, almost a grunt. Then I heard it move, not toward us, not parallel, but away, up the slope, back into the deep forest, back into the laurel and the ancient hemlock stands where no trail led. We stood there for a long time, afraid to believe it was over. We reached the vehicles at 2 in the afternoon. Samantha's ankle was badly broken, and Carl carried her on his back for the final stretch, refusing help, his face locked in exhaustion and resolve. We drove to the hospital in Whitesburg in a silence so dense it had its own gravity. Samantha was treated for a displaced fracture. The rest of us sat in the waiting room under buzzing fluorescent lights that felt like a different planet from the world we had just left, and we did not speak. There were no words for what we had experienced. Language is built for a world with rules, and the thing in the holler existed outside every rule we had ever been taught. When we parted in the parking lot in the golden light of late June, Harold shook each of our hands. When he got to me, he held on and looked me in the eye. "You saw it," he said. I nodded. "People will not believe you, I know." He looked up at the mountains, close enough to walk into, close enough to disappear inside forever. "It has always been there," he said. "It will always be there. And it is not the only one. It has been 7 years since Dismal Branch. 7 years of waking at 3 in the morning with the sheets soaked through and the echo of that vocalization fading from my ears like the last note of a song I never wanted to hear. I have not been camping since. I have not set foot in a forest of any kind. When I drive through the countryside and the trees press close to the road, I feel my hands tighten on the wheel and my eyes move to the shadows between the trunks. Nicole sold her guiding business and moved to Florida where the land is flat and the horizon visible in every direction. Carl does not talk about what happened, but he does not sleep well, and his wife tells me he keeps a loaded rifle by the bed and a floodlight on the back of the house that stays on every night. Rose wrote a memoir and included a chapter about our trip. The publisher cut it because they said it did not fit the tone of the rest of the book. Samantha still photographs wilderness landscapes, but no longer works alone and no longer goes into the Appalachian Mountains. She told me she keeps the camera from that day in a drawer and cannot bring herself to look at the last photographs on its memory card. Photographs she does not remember taking, which show something standing in the trees behind her, looking directly into the lens. Harold Boyd died in 2021 at 77. His granddaughter told me that in his final days he spoke often about the mountains and the thing in the deep hollers, and that his last coherent words were a warning. Do not go into the laurel. It is still there. I believe him. I believe every word. And if you are listening to this and planning a trip into the backcountry of eastern Kentucky, into the hollers where the creeks run cold and the hemlocks stand like sentinels and the ridges stack against the sky like the walls of a fortress built by something older than humanity, I am asking you to reconsider. Stay on the marked trails, camp in the established sites, keep to the places where other people go. Because beyond those boundaries, in the deep places where the laurel grows so thick it swallows the light and the silence presses in like the weight of the mountain itself, there is something waiting. Something that was old when the first settlers carved their homesteads out of the forest. Something that watched the coal companies gut the mountains and outlasted them all. It has been waiting for a very long time, and it is patient, far more patient than you. There are sounds in this world that do not belong to anything living, and I know that now because I heard one of them in the summer of 2019, deep in the hemlock forests of northern Pennsylvania. I was 37 years old when it happened, and I have not gone back to those woods since. What I am about to tell you is the truth as I experienced it, and I understand if you choose not to believe a single word, because if someone had told me this story before that July, I would have dismissed them entirely. But I was there. I saw what I saw. I heard what I heard. And some nights, when the air is still and the hour is late, I can still hear that weeping coming from somewhere far behind me. Somewhere I cannot reach. Somewhere I never want to reach again. It started as a simple trip. 6 of us in total, heading out for a week of hiking, camping, and fishing in the Appalachian wilderness of Pennsylvania. Up in the northern tier where the forests grow thick and the towns grow thin and the cell service drops to nothing within the first 10 miles of gravel road. The whole thing was organized around Victor Holmes, 57, a retired forester who had spent the better part of 3 decades working for the State Conservation Department. Victor knew about a place he called the Hemlock Corridor, a long stretch of old-growth forest tucked between 2 ridgelines in Potter County, far from any marked trail, far from any campground, far from anything resembling civilization. He had worked that section of forest back in the 1990s, and he swore it was the most beautiful and the most unsettling piece of land he had ever walked. I remember how he said that word, unsettling. He did not say it like a warning, he said it like an invitation. The rest of the group came together over a few weeks. Megan Black was 32 and worked as a wildlife photographer. She had a quiet intensity, the kind of person who could sit behind a camera for 6 hours waiting for a single frame. Judy Dixon was 64, a retired schoolteacher from Williamsport who had taken up long-distance hiking after her husband passed. She was wiry and sharp and carried a walking stick carved from hickory that she claimed her grandfather had shaped by hand. Philip Ramos was the oldest among us at 73, a former hunting guide who had spent most of his adult life in the Allegheny National Forest. He moved slowly but deliberately and knew more about the Pennsylvania wilderness than anyone I had ever met. And finally Irene Stone, 50, a nurse practitioner from Scranton who joined at the last minute after seeing Victor mention the trip in a community hiking group. She was friendly and careful and carried a first aid kit large enough to supply a small clinic. We met at a gas station in Gallatin on a Tuesday morning in mid-July. The sky was pale blue and the heat was already pressing down on the asphalt by 8 in the morning. Victor arrived in his old green pickup with a topographic map spread across the dashboard and a look on his face I can only describe as boyish excitement. He had not been back to the Hemlock Corridor in over 20 years, and he talked about it the way some people talk about a place they once loved and lost. We loaded our packs into 2 vehicles and followed a series of increasingly narrow roads north and west, past farms and lumber yards and small churches with hand-painted signs, until the pavement ended and the gravel began. The gravel road went on for nearly an hour, and with every mile the world outside the windows grew wilder and quieter and more closed in. The forest closed in on both sides, first maple and oak, then gradually shifting to the tall, straight trunks of eastern hemlock, their canopy so dense that the sunlight barely reached the ground. Victor pulled over near a rusted gate and killed the engine. "From here we walk," he said. The trail was little more than a faint depression in the forest floor, a line of slightly flattened ferns winding between the hemlocks. Victor led the way with Philip close behind, the two of them exchanging quiet observations about fungus on a stump or a deer scrape on a sapling. We hiked for about 4 hours before Victor found his spot, a flat clearing beside a narrow creek that ran cold and clear over smooth stones. The hemlocks ringed the clearing on 3 sides, and a low ridge rose to the east, covered in ferns and moss so green it almost looked artificial. It was beautiful. Even now, knowing what happened there, I cannot deny that the place was beautiful in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the forest had arranged itself to draw you in. We set up camp in the clearing. 3 tents arranged in a loose triangle, a small fire ring built from creek stones, a line strung between 2 trees for hanging food bags away from bears. Philip disappeared downstream with a collapsible rod and came back within 30 minutes, carrying 2 brook trout, their scales still flashing copper and gold in the fading light. Judy boiled water for coffee on a camp stove, while Megan vanished into the trees with her camera, chasing the last of the afternoon light through the canopy. We ate fish and rice and sat around the fire as the sky turned from blue to amber to the deep purple gray of Appalachian twilight. Victor told stories about his years in these forests. Philip added his own, quieter and more measured. It was Judy who heard it first. She stopped mid-sentence and held up one hand and tilted her head the way a dog does when it catches a sound it cannot identify. "Do you hear that?" she said. We all went quiet. At first I heard nothing but the creek and the insects. Then I heard it, a sound I can only describe as weeping, faint, distant, muffled by the trees, but unmistakable. Someone or something was crying in the forest. It was not a bobcat or a screech owl. It was a low, wet, shuddering sound, full of what I can only call sorrow. It rose and fell in long, uneven waves, like a person trying to catch their breath between sobs. It came from somewhere to the north, and it seemed to move, drifting slowly through the trees. Philip stood up and stared into the shadows. "That is not an animal I recognize," he said, and the way he said it made the hair on my arms stand up. Victor said nothing. He sat very still with his eyes fixed on the tree line, and the color had drained from his face. The weeping continued for perhaps 3 or 4 minutes. Then it stopped, abruptly, as if someone had pressed a hand over the mouth of whatever was making the sound. The silence that followed was worse. It had a weight to it, a pressure, like the air before a thunderstorm. We sat around the fire for another hour, but nobody spoke much after that. Megan asked if it could have been a lost hiker, someone in distress, and Philip shook his head and said that the nearest marked trail was 15 miles south and that nobody came out this far. Irene suggested it might have been a porcupine because they make strange sounds at night. Philip looked at her and then looked away without responding. When I crawled into my tent, I lay awake for a long time, listening to the forest. The creek muttered over its stones. The wind stirred the hemlock boughs in slow rolling waves. An owl called once from somewhere on the ridge and was not answered. But the weeping did not return, not that night. I fell asleep sometime after midnight and dreamed of water, still and opaque and warm, spreading slowly across a forest floor. In the dream I knelt beside it and touched it with my fingers, and it clung to my skin like something alive. I woke before dawn with my heart hammering against my ribs and a feeling in my chest that I could not name. A heaviness that had no source, a sadness that did not belong to me. The morning came gray and damp. I was the first one out of the tents, and I stood in the clearing and felt, for the first time, that the forest was looking back. Victor emerged a few minutes later and walked straight to me and said something I have never forgotten. He said, "I should have told you about this place before we came." He sat on a log and stared into the trees and told me about a word I had never heard before, squonk. He said that when the old lumberjacks worked these hemlock forests in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, cutting down ancient trees and hauling them out on mule-drawn sledges, they used to gather around their campfires at night and talk about the things they had seen and heard in the groves. One creature came up more than any other. They called it the squonk. They said it was covered from head to foot in warts and blemishes and loose sagging skin, so hideous that it could not bear to be seen. It spent its life hiding, moving only at twilight, and it wept constantly, not from pain but from shame, from a sadness so deep and so total that it had become the only thing the creature knew. The lumberjack said that if you cornered one, it would dissolve entirely into a pool of tears. Victor said he had always assumed it was just a tall tale. But in '94, working alone in this same forest, he heard the weeping for 3 nights. On the 4th night he found a patch of wet earth near his camp, about 2 feet across, glistening in his flashlight, warm to the touch, with no source and no explanation. He packed up his camp the next morning before sunrise, and hiked out alone, and drove home, and did not tell anyone what he had seen or heard for over 2 decades, until now, until he brought 5 strangers back to the place that had haunted him for 25 years. I asked him why he brought us here. He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that was not fear, but something adjacent to it. I wanted to know if it was still here, he said. I wanted to know if I imagined it. He had not imagined it. None of us had. The second day began before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. The air was cool, and the mist hung low in the hemlocks, and the forest had that particular quality of morning stillness that makes everything feel held in place, suspended, waiting. Philip was up before the rest of us, as he always was, and he had gone north on his own to check the perimeter. He came back with a look on his face that I had not seen before, a mixture of fascination and unease. He told me to come look at something. It was about 20 yards from camp, just past the tree line where the hemlocks grew so close you had to turn sideways to pass between them. He called me over with a low whistle and pointed at the ground. There, in a shallow depression between 2 roots, was a circle of wet earth roughly the size of a dinner plate. The soil around it was dry. There had been no rain. The creek was 40 yards south. And yet this ground was soaked, not with water exactly, but with something thicker, something that caught the light in a way water does not. I knelt and touched it. It was warm. It had a faint smell that I struggle to describe, almost sweet, almost like the smell of fresh skin. Philip said, I have tracked every animal in these mountains for 50 years, and I have never seen anything leave a mark like that. We showed it to the others. Victor looked at it and looked away. Judy pressed her palm against it and studied the residue. Irene asked if it could be tree sap. Philip told her hemlocks do not produce sap like that. Megan photographed it from several angles. When she reviewed the images later, she noticed something none of us had seen with bare eyes. In the wet patch, caught at just the right angle, there were tiny fragments of something that looked like skin, thin, translucent, curled at the edges, like the shed scales of something that was falling apart. That was the morning I began to feel afraid. Not the sudden fear of a loud noise, but the slow, heavy fear that builds in the stomach and sits there like a stone. We debated what to do. Judy wanted to explore further north. Philip agreed but insisted we stay together. Victor was quiet and conflicted. Megan wanted to go toward it. She always wanted to go toward the thing others moved away from. Irene was the only one who suggested we leave, but Judy said she had not hiked 4 hours into the wilderness to turn around because of a wet spot, so we went north. Victor led us along the creek for about a mile, then turned east, following a faint game trail up the ridge through hemlocks so old their trunks were wider than my arm span. The forest floor was covered in a thick carpet of needles that muffled our steps. The canopy was so dense that almost no light reached the ground, and the world beneath the trees existed in permanent green-tinged shadow. We walked for 2 hours. Nobody spoke much. The forest demanded silence in a way I cannot fully explain. Talking felt wrong, like speaking in a library or laughing at a funeral. The trees pressed in on all sides, and the air was cool and still and heavy with the sharp medicinal scent of hemlock resin. Occasionally a branch would crack somewhere in the canopy above us, and the sound would echo through the columns of trunks like a gunshot, and every time it happened all 6 of us would freeze and listen, and then resume walking without comment. Philip stopped first. He held up his fist, and we all froze. He was staring at the ground ahead. I moved beside him and felt my stomach drop. The game trail ended at a patch of ground roughly 6 feet across that was completely saturated. The earth was soaked through, pooling in low spots, and scattered across the surface were dozens of those translucent skin fragments. Some were the size of a fingernail, others were larger, and they were not flat. They were curved, shaped, as if they had peeled away from something with a contour, a body. There were warts on some of them, raised bumps, and rough textured blemishes in irregular patterns. I picked one up. It was soft and damp, and it tore easily. Irene knelt and examined them with professional attention. Her face was composed, but her hands were not steady. "This is epithelial tissue," she said quietly. "This is skin, not hide, not bark. Skin." Philip asked what kind of animal could shed skin like this. She did not answer. We continued north. Something pulled us forward, not curiosity exactly, but the same compulsion that makes you slow down passing an accident, the need to see even when every rational part of your brain says look away. We found 3 more wet patches over the next mile, each larger, each containing more fragments, each warm. That evening back at camp, the weeping started again. Closer this time, much closer. It came from the north and moved through the trees with a slow, deliberate rhythm, almost like breathing. The sound was wet and broken and full of a grief so profound that it was almost physically painful to hear. I have listened to people cry at funerals, at hospitals, at the scenes of accidents. What I heard in those hemlocks was not like any of that. It was deeper, older. A sound that came from the very bottom of whatever was making it, from a place of sadness so complete that there was no room for anything else. No anger, no fear, no hope. Just sorrow, pure and unrelenting. Judy put her hands over her ears. Megan lowered her camera. Philip took 2 steps toward the tree line and then stopped. Victor sat with his head bowed, and tears were running down his face without a sound. It went on for 20 minutes. The weeping moved in a wide arc around our camp, circling at 50 or 60 yards, never closer, never retreating. Then it stopped, and in the silence I heard something else. Quieter, closer, almost at the edge of the firelight. A sound like wet cloth being dragged across the ground. I turned my flashlight toward the tree line, and for less than a second I saw it. I saw the squonk. What I saw does not conform to any animal I have ever encountered. It was low to the ground, perhaps 3 feet tall at the shoulder, but its proportions were wrong in a way that made my eyes ache. Its body was roughly the size of a large dog, but shaped more like a person who had been compressed into a form that was never meant to hold a human shape. Its skin was the worst part. It hung loose in heavy folds and wrinkles, sagging, covered in warts and blisters and open sores that wept clear fluid. The skin looked too large for the body underneath, as if the creature was slowly deflating, slowly losing whatever substance held it together. Its face was turned away from me. I saw only the side of its head, a heavy misshapen dome covered in the same warted skin, with a limp flap of tissue that hung past where a jaw might have been. Every part of it was wet, not with blood, with tears. The creature was weeping from every pore, every sore, every crack in its ruined skin, producing a constant flow of warm fluid that pooled on the ground beneath it. It was dissolving, slowly, constantly, dissolving into its own grief. Then it turned its head toward the light, and I saw its eyes, and I dropped the flashlight, and I screamed. Its eyes were human, not human-like, human, brown and wet and clear, and filled with an intelligence and a despair so vast that looking into them felt like falling into a hole with no bottom. Those eyes knew what they were. Those eyes knew how they looked. Those eyes carried a self-awareness that was worse than any mindless predatory stare. The creature saw itself, and what it saw was unbearable. I scrambled backward and hit the ground hard, and the cold of the forest floor shot through my spine. Megan grabbed the flashlight and swung the beam back toward the tree line, but the creature was gone. In the exact spot where it had been crouching there was a puddle, warm, glistening, about 2 feet across, and floating in the center of the puddle, slowly sinking, was a single piece of that warded translucent skin, curling at the edges as it dissolved into the liquid it had once contained. The smell hit us then, that sweet organic scent magnified tenfold, filling the clearing, filling our lungs, filling the space behind our eyes. Irene turned away and gagged. Judy pressed her face into the sleeve of her jacket. Nobody moved toward the puddle. Nobody moved at all. We did not sleep that night. We sat around the fire with our backs to each other and our eyes on the trees and waited for dawn. Philip was the first to speak. He said, "I have been in these woods my whole life, and I always thought the squonk was a joke, a tall tale to scare the new lumberjacks." He looked at his trembling hands. "That was no tall tale," he said. "We should have left at first light. Every one of us knew it, but none of us moved to break camp when the gray morning crept through the hemlocks. We were tired and shaken, and something else. Something I did not have a word for then, but now recognize as contaminated. The squonk's grief had gotten into us, not metaphorically, literally. Something about hearing that sound, about seeing that creature, about standing in the presence of that much concentrated sorrow, had changed the chemistry of our minds. I could feel it the way you feel the onset of a fever, a heaviness behind the eyes, a weight on the chest with no physical cause. Victor was worst. He sat on his log and did not move for 2 hours. His eyes were open but unfocused. He told me things I do not think he meant to tell me. He told me about his daughter who died in a car accident in 2004. He told me about his wife who left the year after. He told me about the years alone in a house too large and too quiet. He told these things without emotion, without tears, the way you would read a list, a catalog of losses. I listened and felt my own grief rising in response, and I had to physically walk away to stop it from overtaking me. Irene found Judy by the creek with tears streaming down her face. Judy said she had not cried for her husband in years and thought she was past it, but now every bit of it was back, fresh and raw, as if he had died that morning. Megan put her camera in her pack and zipped it shut and pushed the pack away from her, as if it contained something she no longer wanted to touch. She sat against a hemlock trunk with her arms wrapped around her knees and stared at the ground. When I asked her if she was all right, she said no, and nothing else, and there was a flatness in her voice that frightened me more than anything I had heard in the forest. Philip was the only one fighting it. He paced the perimeter with his jaw clenched, stopping every few minutes to close his eyes and breathe as if pushing something out through force of will. I asked what he was doing. He said he was trying not to think about his son. I did not ask what about his son. Whatever door the squonk had opened in each of us led somewhere private and terrible. My own was bad enough. I thought about my mother, the arguments before she died. The phone call I did not make the night she passed because I was angry, because I was stubborn, because I thought there would be more time. I thought about all the years telling myself it did not matter. Standing in that forest with the squonk's grief running through me, I knew none of that was true. It mattered, and it was too late. Philip called us together at mid-morning and said we were leaving. He did not ask for opinions. "We are packing up and walking out, and we are not coming back," he said, and there was something in his voice that cut through the fog and got us moving. We broke camp in 20 minutes and started south along the creek. Victor moved like a sleepwalker. Judy leaned on her walking stick. Irene stayed close to Victor, watching him with clinical attention. Philip set an almost aggressive pace. We made it about 2 miles before the trail was blocked, not by a fallen tree, by wet ground. A stretch of forest floor roughly 30 feet wide and extending in both directions as far as I could see was completely saturated. The earth was soft and warm and covered in translucent skin fragments, hundreds of them, scattered like the remains of something that had exploded from the inside out. The smell was strong here, stronger than any of the patches we had found before. That sweet organic scent that was almost like living flesh, but not quite, like something that had been alive very recently and was only now beginning to understand that it was not anymore. And the weeping was back. Not behind us this time, not circling from the north. It was ahead of us. It was directly ahead, coming from the forest to the south, from the land between us and the gravel road, between us and the trucks, between us and the way out. Philip stopped at the edge and stared. He looked old. "Every one of his 73 years, he said. "It does not want us to leave." I asked what he meant. He gestured at the wet ground. "The squonk," he said. "It is not blocking the trail. It is the trail. It has been dissolving itself across this forest for God knows how long, spreading out, becoming the ground we walk on. Every puddle, every wet patch, every piece of skin is a piece of this thing. It has been coming apart for years, maybe decades, and it is everywhere now. We are standing in it. We have been standing in it since we arrived." Irene said that was impossible. Philip knelt and picked up a skin fragment the size of his palm, covered in warts, still wet, still warm, still weeping its own fluid even separated from whatever body it had belonged to. He let it fall, and it hit the ground with a sound like a whisper. Victor sat on a rock and put his face in his hands. Megan stood apart from the group and stared into the trees with an expression that was not fear and was not grief, but looked almost like understanding. "I need to go to it," she said. Philip told her absolutely not. "You do not understand," she said. "It is not trying to hurt us. It is trying to show us something." I asked what. She looked at me and her eyes were wet and clear, and for a moment I saw in them the same expression I had seen in the squonk's eyes, that terrible lucidity. "It is trying to show us what grief does when you carry it alone," she said. "It dissolves you, takes you apart piece by piece until nothing is left but the sadness itself. That is what the squonk is. It is not a creature. It is what happens when something becomes nothing but its own pain. We stood in silence. Then Philip found another way. He led us east, along the edge of the wet patch, climbing the ridge through younger hemlocks where the ground was dry. We scrambled over rocks and through thorny undergrowth and across a narrow ravine choked with deadfall. Irene slipped on a wet stone and cut her palm open and wrapped it in a bandage from her own kit without slowing down. Victor stumbled twice, and both times Philip reached back and pulled him upright without a word. Judy climbed with her walking stick in one hand and the other gripping roots and branches, pulling herself up the slope with a ferocity that seemed fueled by something beyond physical strength. Slowly, gradually, the wet ground fell behind us. The weeping faded. Not all at once, but in stages, growing softer and more distant with each step we took away from the hemlock corridor, until it was just a whisper, and then less than a whisper, and then nothing. We reached the gravel road at dusk and drove south without speaking. I dropped Philip at his house in Cottersport. He shook my hand at his front door and held it for a long time and went inside. He died the following March. I sometimes wonder if those woods took something from him he could not get back. Victor sat in the passenger seat staring out the window. At his driveway he turned to me and said, "It is still weeping." I told him I did not hear anything. He nodded. "I know," he said. "I hear it all the time now, when I try to sleep, when I sit in my living room. I think it followed me home." Irene emailed me a week later. She had researched the squonk and found references in a book from 1910 by a naturalist named William T. Cox, who collected lumberjack stories from the American Northeast. The squonk was described as the most unhappy creature in all of American folklore, covered in deformities, perpetually ashamed, hiding in the deepest hemlock groves, and weeping without ceasing. When captured, it dissolved entirely into tears. The book treated it as a humorous tall tale. After Potter County, she did not find it humorous at all. She said she had not been sleeping well. She said she kept arriving at the same conclusion, one she could not accept professionally and could not deny as someone who had been there. The squonk was real. A living thing that had been suffering alone in those forests for longer than anyone could say, shedding its skin, weeping its body away, dissolving slowly into a grief with no end and no relief. And it was still there. Megan called in August. She had deleted every photograph from the hemlock corridor except 3. The 3 that showed the shape in the shadows between the trees. She believed what she was looking at was not one creature, but the remains of one. The outline of something that had once been whole and was now barely there, held together by nothing but the force of its own misery. She thought the squonk was almost gone, almost completely dissolved. She thought the weeping we heard was the sound of the last of it coming apart. I asked if she would publish the photographs. She laughed, but it was not a real laugh. Who would believe them, she said. Judy called once, on a Sunday in October. She talked about hiking, all of it on marked trails now, nothing remote. Then she went quiet and said, "I still think about that sound, Sean, every day." She said the trip had shown her something she needed to see. For years she had carried grief the way the squonk carried its skin, draped over her like something too heavy, something that did not fit anymore, but that she could not put down. Hearing that weeping made her realize that grief, if you let it, will consume you entirely, will dissolve you into nothing but itself, and the only way to survive it is to set it down, to let it exist without becoming it. I do not know if she was right. I do not know if the squonk is a cautionary tale or just a tragedy without a moral. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know that somewhere in the hemlock forests of northern Pennsylvania there is a creature that has been weeping for longer than anyone can remember. A creature so consumed by its own sorrow that it is literally falling apart, and that one day there will be nothing left of it but a warm, wet patch on the forest floor, and a memory of a sound no one alive will be able to explain. I have not gone back. I will not go back. But I would be lying if I said the hemlock corridor let me go entirely. It did not. Something from those woods came home with every one of us, not the creature itself, but the knowledge of it, the understanding of what it means to carry grief until it becomes all you are, until it eats through your skin and drips from your bones and leaves nothing behind but a warm stain on the ground where you used to be. If you have ever walked through a forest and heard a sound that you could not explain, a sound that made you stop and listen and feel something shift inside your chest, then you know what I am talking about. And if you have not, I hope you never do. Some nights, in the hours before dawn, I lie in my bed and listen to the silence of my apartment. And beneath it, beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic and the slow settling of the building around me, I hear it. Faint, far away, steady, weeping. And I do not know if it is the squonk or if it is me.